so grateful to have my guest, Dr. Patricia Hasbach. Patricia, welcome to Stories from the Field.
Thanks, Will. Thank you for having me.
Oh, I'm so excited because you have written a book which I think is so important for the field of people who do mental health treatment in outdoor settings. And you've written other books too. So let's just start out with, tell us a little bit about yourself, your practice, and what drew you to write the book, Prescribing Nature.
I think so many people who have an interest in ecopsychology or ecotherapy or any type of outdoor therapy, we've probably had a deep love for the outdoors growing up. I grew up in a rural area in Western Pennsylvania, and I walked the hills and spent a lot of time outdoors as a kid. And I was fortunate. I had a family that really appreciated the outdoors. We had gardens and orchards and that kind of thing. I grew up knowing how important the connection with nature was for me personally, both in terms of the joy it brought in life and the healing that it could bring at harder times. I did my graduate work at the University of Pittsburgh, my master's degree and my PhD there, and had a typical practice in the South Hills area of Pittsburgh for a number of years, and then moved out to Oregon in 2004 and started to do work more outdoors. And I can tell you a little bit more about that as we go along. But I want to share, I have probably had my first professional awareness of the impact of the outdoors when I was working with a client who, this was maybe in the early 90s. He was in a rehab program, a cardiac rehab program at our local hospital. And at that time, it was very early in my practice, and I was consulting for that program for people who were having some difficulties psychologically that was getting in the way of them doing their rehab work, their physical rehab work after coming back from a cardiac event. And we were just learning about the social and emotional aspects of recovery from a cardiac event at that time. Usually once a week, I would go over to the rehab program and meet with someone if they had people lined up for me to see or talk with. Because again, back then there was sometimes some resistance of meeting with a therapist or a counselor. And I was given a file and was looking at the patient's chart and noticed that he was resistant to talking with a counselor or a therapist. He was an owner of a landscape company, I noted. So when he came to talk with me, he was pretty anxious, wringing his hands and really didn't want to talk to me. And just intuitively, I thought they've just built a new courtyard that was adjacent to the rehab program. And I suggested we take a walk outdoors. I thought he would likely be more comfortable there. And I found as we walked the little curving path in this small courtyard, he started to point out different plants and trees that were there that were going to do well or not so well. And we sat down on the bench and I asked him how he got involved in his interest in gardening and landscaping work. And he told his story and became visibly more comfortable. By the end of our session, he had shared that his fear was that he would never be able to get back to doing the physical work involved in his business after his heart attack. And it became a real aha moment for me because it really seemed like our surroundings played a huge role in him becoming more comfortable. And it made a lot of sense to me. And like most therapists and counselors, nature was not part of our training. Incorporating nature back then was not part of our training. And so I experimented a little bit with just taking people out. And not long after, a brochure came to my office for a workshop called Ecopsychology for Educators. I thought, what is this? It's the first time I heard this term. And it was being held in California, Palo Alto. And it was a 3-day conference. And I decided I really have to go. It resonated with me. And it was right after the book came out that was the initial anthology of ecopsychology that was edited by Rozek, Hanner, and Gomes. It was called Ecopsychology, Restoring the Earth, Healing the Mind. The book is an anthology by multiple writers that talked about their experiences in the outdoors in various settings, from more wilderness areas to more domestic office settings, of taking people outdoors. And I was hooked. This is something I really need to explore. And then years later, when I moved out to Oregon, I pursued a master's degree at Naropa University, postdoctorate, another master's degree in transpersonal psychology, because they were the only degree program I could find that had a concentration in ecopsychology. And one of the organizers from that conference, he and I had stayed in contact, and he was responsible for growing that program. His name was Jed Swift. And it was from there that I really developed my love for incorporating nature into the work.
Your book begins with theoretical foundations of ecotherapy and the concepts of ecological self. And can you explain how these ideas shifted or reshaped your traditional therapeutic frameworks and why it's so pivotal right now?
Yeah. I guess I should first identify what the ecological self is. And I think when we consider that humans are nature, we're part of nature, and we have a relationship with nature, whether we're conscious of it or not, that's when we acknowledge the ecological self, that we're part of nature and we have a relationship with nature. And I often, when I think about this framework that we work in as therapists or counselors, I like to use the analogy of the lens of a camera. So when we think about how we can open up the lens with the various f-stops of a camera lens, that's the analogy I use when I teach my students. And so we often, in even traditional therapy, we start in looking at what's some of the internal things that are happening with the person. What's the intrapsychic things that happen with the person that we're working with? And then we open that lens a little further and we look at what are some of the interpersonal relationships that the person's interacting with. And then we can open that up a little further and think about the family system the person came from, their family of origin, as well as the family system that they're living in now. And how are they impacting and impacted by that system? And then we open up the camera lens a little further and we think about the different cultural or social impacts on the person. So this is maybe where we think about ageism or sexism or racism or all the different kinds of challenges and privileges that people have within culture and society. And traditionally, therapy has stopped at that boundary. When we think about it, I often say we stop at the urban boundary. Ecopsychology and ecotherapy expands that lens one step further to include the ecological system that the person lives in and is involved in. And what kind of relationship do they have or disconnect they're experiencing from the natural world. That's how the framework expands when we think about our relationship with nature. It includes the relationship with nature. And it is especially important right now that we acknowledge that, really for two reasons. One is we've got what we've known intuitively, those of us who work outdoors with people, that nature's good for us and getting outdoors in nature is good for us. We're all kind of out there on a limb doing this. And now, in the last 10 years, there's just been this explosion of research that supports these practices and gives us a roadmap of practices to make this a best practice for therapy. So we know from the studies today that interacting with the natural world lowers stress, reduces ruminations, those negative thoughts connected to depression, lessens anxiety, reduces ADHD symptoms in adults and kids. And we also have shown that interacting with nature fosters creativity, improves our cognitive function, restores attention fatigue that we often get when we're looking at screens so long, and increases our sense of happiness. And it can impact pro-social and pro-environmental behaviors. And we're also really spending so much time engaged with our screens and with technology in general, digital technology in particular, and social media. And I often think interacting with real world time in the natural world helps provide a balance. So that's covered one big area of why including nature in the lens with which we see someone in a therapeutic setting is so important. The other big reason is climate change and the impact that people are experiencing in dealing with our changing climate. And that really happens two ways. People who are directly impacted by climate related events and trauma that can happen from that. And also something we call eco anxiety, or just this low grade worry, fear of knowing that there's something going on in our environment that is not healthy for the environment or us. So when we acknowledge the ecological self and the relationship humans have, we're in a better position to address some of these psychological impacts of climate change. We might have it on our radar that we're listening for it differently as counselors and therapists. And in the book, I ask therapists to reflect on how does the individual clinician address the chronic psychological impacts of climate change? Do we recognize these chronic stressors and emotions that are in response to these gradual effects of change around us? And are we even asking the right questions? So I would say that is how expanding this framework has relevance today, particularly today.
And once again, I want to tell people the name of the book is Prescribing Nature, a clinician's guide to ecotherapy. And I was reflecting on what you were just saying, because I live in a very rural area. And I'm in the woods a lot. And yet we are going through a horrible drought here in New England. We will have probably one of the
Wow.
worst fall foliages we've had in at
Mm.
least 15, 20 years. And although I'm in green spaces a lot, it's actually increasing my anxiety because water holes are all drying up. And it's very interesting that because nature can be a partner in the therapeutic process. And sometimes nature triggers us to reflect on, wow, life is short. This very big pool of water is now gone and it was here most of my life. It's a very interesting concepts. And as a clinician, you encourage people to talk about that, clinicians to talk with their clients about it, correct?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I think what we see is that people have these worries, they have these concerns. There was a study done in 2021 in the US. About 1,000 adults were surveyed, and they found that 74% of them said they were experiencing at least moderate level of what we call eco anxiety today. But only about 59% of them thought other people were as concerned about. And we think that that has contributed to some of the silence on the topic. And I think also some of the isolation that's there. So when we bring nature into the therapeutic process early on, right at intake, by asking people about their relationship with nature, it opens that pathway for people to feel comfortable that this is a topic that might be appropriate for me to talk to the counselor about too. And when people talk about their grief or their fear or their anxiety or their feeling of even guilt or complicity, it gives them a space to do that we haven't had before.
There's been a huge rise in outpatient practitioners using the outdoors and the timeliness of your book. I can't say enough about it. I will be telling lots of people, and lots of people will listen to this episode.
Okay.
And you've been a practitioner for many years. Northwest Ecotherapy is your private practice. Can you kind of share a memorable moment when nature took stage and a center stage in your therapeutic work?
Yeah, two things come to mind. One is I was working with a young man, late 20s, early 30s, who he grew up in very urban centers. He lived in multiple cities and had very little experience with nature and growing up. And he got himself into a fair amount of trouble and really was dealing with addiction, had gone to rehab. And I saw him after he had moved to his parents' place temporarily as part of his kind of coming together after his rehab work. And his parents had retired and lived in a more rural area. And I wanted to ask him about his connection with the natural world to see how open he might be to spending a little bit of time outdoors. And at first, I think he was a little puzzled by it, the question. But I wrote what we call a nature prescription for him. So it's not uncommon for counselors or therapists to give clients a homework assignment to do between sessions that extend their work of a session. And when it incorporates nature, some of us call it a nature prescription. But I asked him if he would be willing to find a place at where he was staying at his parents' home that he would feel comfortable visiting several times a week for a period of a month and just go and sit. So the first assignment was to just go and find a place that he felt comfortable, that he thought he would enjoy. And then the next part of the assignment, or the prescription, was to go there several times a week, 2 to 3 times a week, at various times of the day, in various weather conditions, and just sit there and notice what drew his attention. Notice where his thoughts went. Notice how his breathing may have changed or his body felt. Notice the relationships around him. And I asked him to do this for 1 month period. He would commit to doing that for 1 month. And he agreed. And what I found in each session is he was really anxious to share with me what he experienced in this periods of time. I saw him for roughly a year and a half. And even at the end of our session time, he was sharing about how he would utilize that space to just unwind sometime or to just sit and relax sometime. And I will never forget that his final statement was to me, nature saved.
Yeah.
Oh, it was really impactful to me to hear him say that. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So, how did you choose that intervention? Like, how does a clinician know what's the right person you would match with a nature prescription or not?
Yeah. Like any intervention that we would do with a person, we really tailor it to that person, to what the issues are that they're dealing with, and what they seem open to doing. When I'm writing a nature prescription, I always co-create it with the client so that they're comfortable with what they've agreed to do. And I find there's much greater compliance in doing it and them following through. And they feel some empowerment of making choices in their own care. So I always include the person in the writing of the prescription. The other thing I do is I actually write down what we agreed to on a little prescription pad that I had printed and give them that piece of paper if it is a in-person session. I also do online sessions. So I have that also online that I can fill in later and email to them. And they seem to appreciate the formality of that prescription pad. And that might be more indicative of the clients I'm working with. I'm not sure, but it's just a practice that I've done as I started to write nature prescriptions. The other way that I really help match up what might be appropriate is the intake session, which is the time we're getting information about the patient's world, the client's world. I do ask questions that help me understand what kind of relationship they have with nature or not. So I may ask, can you tell me an early memory you had growing up being in nature when we talk about the family of origin? And I keep it very open-ended because they might tell me something that was scary, or they might tell me something that they didn't like about being in nature, or an environment that they didn't like, or one that they were really drawn to. It often gets enveloped in with talking about maybe grandparents or aunts and uncles or a family member and good memories of those things. I ask that in the intake session. I ask about how much time they get to be outdoors now, what they like to do when they're outdoors. So it gives me a picture of what role does nature play in their life today, and what environments they might be drawn to today, and how much time they can take for that. So I get a lot of information right up front while I'm taking the other intake information. And then sometimes it's just in the course of our discussion, I hear what they're interested in. And then you just get a little bit creative in saying, what do you think about? Or if a certain topic has come up, how do we design a prescription or any other homework assignment that would be very potent for that particular topic? Another good example of that is I worked with someone that was very broken up about a long-term relationship that had ended. And I had worked with her over many months. And I knew from that she was a very good amateur photographer. She really liked to take photographs of nature. And she was an outdoor person. And she was going on a short trip to the mountains. And I asked her if she would be willing to take some photographs of the mountains or whatever drew her attention at sunset. Think about the end of the day. And if she would, but she also was journaling through the time of our work together. And I asked her if she would also enter at the same time some journal entries about the closing of this chapter in her life of this after this relationship ended. And that was the words we had been using, closing the chapter on that part of her life. And so it was a kind of a spontaneous way of thinking about how do we incorporate that sort of periodicity of nature that we're surrounded by with the work that she was doing. And so she came back a week or so later after her trip, and she brought some photographs that she took of the sunset of mountains and shared with me some of her notes from her journal about the closing. And then she said, so I was so taken with this, and it felt so good to see this beauty after the sun went down, after it fell below the horizon. There was this sort of afterglow. And she said, I realized that's where I was in my own journey. The relationship had ended, and I'm starting to step out, and I'm feeling some of the afterglow. She said, so I got up a couple mornings later at sunrise and took pictures too, which was going to be my assignment or my nature prescription down the road. She beat me to it. She intuitively knew there was something new to open up. So it's looking at how we incorporate what is right around us in a creative way that deepens and broadens our healing process.
Yeah. Beautiful. Yeah. What sort of unique challenges or ethical considerations emerge when you move therapy outdoors or integrate nature prescriptions? And it's more and more I talk to people on this podcast who are doing it, and there's no kind of formal certification. There's one group that the Association for Experiential Education has an adventure therapy certification. Your book really focuses about a clinician who wants to integrate the outdoors. And how does the book guide people to make the right decisions in providing treatment, including nature?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's one that's certainly, I think, a concern that we need to be incorporating a lot more of this kind of work in our training and in our certification areas. But there's 3 areas that all of our professional organizations, like the American Psychological Association, the American Counseling Association, the Professional Association for Social Workers, we all have a code of ethics. And in the book, I talk about how there's 3 main areas that we have to really pay attention to that are actually already covered in our code of ethics, but they could be maybe spelled out even a little bit more clearly when it comes to interactions in the outdoors. And those 3 areas include confidentiality, avoiding harm, and competency. So when I'm working with someone, I always meet them in the office, usually multiple times before we're going to move outdoors. And it's incumbent on the therapist to alert people to what could be something new or uncomfortable or confusing, like issues of confidentiality. What happens if we happen to be walking along the trail or the bike path or sitting by the river and we see somebody that one of us knows? How do we handle that? So we want to have that discussion ahead of time before we go outdoors. The avoiding harm piece is, again, we really look at, most of us assume that our office spaces are physically safe and emotionally safe for our clients. And that's all part of our basic training. And that we're going to work within areas that we're trained to work in. When we move outdoors, again, it's the clinician's responsibility to be sure that we're moving into as safe as environment as possible and alert our client to the possibility that we are moving outside of this container space. So I think it's really important to have that discussion with somebody ahead of time. When we're just walking on a bike path, or we're sitting in a garden, or we're sitting on a deck outside an office space, these are all the kind of varying scenarios that therapists might have to be outdoors. The risk is pretty low. If we're moving into a little bit wilder environs, if we're moving to moving water, or we're walking on a narrow trail, we have to be a little bit more mindful about that and be sure that we're raising those concerns. Even when I take somebody on, there's a walking path, a bike path right out from my office that I most often take people to. And it's a very relatively benign experience. But I ask people in the office, are you allergic to bees? Do you have any particular asthma issues? Do you have issues that I should be concerned about that we need to be just aware of? And even if I'm just walking there, I have a light bag I take with me that has water in it and has my cell phone in it if there would be a problem, has Kleenex in it, has just some really basic comfort kinds of things that if we would ever have a problem. In the years I've been doing this, I've never really had that happen in that kind of a setting. But if I'm taking somebody up on the river and we're on rocks, I want to be sure that they are competent to be in that environment and comfortable to be in that environment. And that's where the other piece of competency comes in. Practitioners really have to be working within their areas of competency, but also be competent in the environment that you're taking people out in. Know what the risks are if you're taking people outdoors to a place. So I do think it's incumbent on the practitioner to assess the risk involved, their own competency, and the comfort and competency of their client. The other areas that I think we have to think about, and it's not necessarily an ethical area, is just the logistics of taking people out. It can get a little, for all the benefits of outdoor therapy, in a traditional practice, it can get difficult sometimes for scheduling. You have unpredictable weather events sometimes. For many years, I would just have one afternoon a week or 2 afternoons a week, if it was the summertime, that I would meet people in a designated spot when I didn't have the office space that I have now. And we would meet in this park, and that's where we would do our walk or hike or whatever. And so the location of the office and its proximity to green or blue space is important. The time it takes to get there, we have to consider that. My office space that I've been in for the last 11 years is in a building that sits right on a walking path that runs along a river that eventually leads to a community park. And there's benches there. There's little quiet spots on the river. We can scamper down the hill, that little embankment, and sit by the river if we want to. And it's very easy to move outdoors there. But not all office spaces are as amenable to that kind of an environment. I mean, it took a long time to find a space like that for myself. Haven't let it go either. But other people, others, former students or other colleagues that I've talked to, they say, I have a home office and I have a big garden. And we go out there and work. Linda Bizzell is a longtime practitioner, ecotherapeutic practitioner in Santa Barbara. And she's got a permaculture forest that she and her husband have created. And she has winding paths that go through that forest that she takes people from. I have a former student that built a yurt that was down over the hill from where he lived, and that's where he sees people. Somebody else will have a deck that's outside, like an office building that had decks out there, and they would just sit out there. So there's different ways people get creative about how to move outdoors in the space. Clearly, it's not wilderness therapy we're talking about here. It's really looking at how does the day-to-day therapist move out into nature, and how do we bring nature into the office space?
You have done so much work in this space, including co-editing Ecopsychology and the rediscovery of the wild to now Prescribing Nature, a clinician's guide to ecotherapy. How has your understanding of ecotherapy evolved and changed over the years?
Oh, it's been a journey to see how the field of ecopsychology and ecotherapy has grown over the years. And I really credit the researchers for providing good evidence of the benefits of connecting with nature that allows the clinician to say, we need to be incorporating this into our work. So that's been a huge piece, is just having this body of literature to draw on that I think is spurring not only psychologists and psychotherapists to incorporate nature, but I'm seeing pediatricians and family practitioners and other physicians looking at how do we get families and particularly kids outdoors more, and how do we encourage a relationship with nature that way. I would also say since the COVID pandemic, I see people really sometimes wanting to spend their time differently. Pace of life has slowed a little bit. An appreciation of our interconnectedness has really expanded. And that's been a big factor in, and an acceptance of getting counseling or therapy, that the stigma is not there nearly so much for most people. And so I think that's been a big factor. During the pandemic, I was approached by a company to write another book for the general public called Grounded. And that book really was I wrote it during the pandemic when I was in sheltering in place. And
you were grounded.
And I was grounded. That's right. And that was the whole idea, is looking at how even if we're living in urban centers, or even if we're being forced to stay indoors more, how do we incorporate more nature into our daily lives? So it's a guided journal that people can write in or give people ideas how to do these things. It's a lot of it are the exercises and the nature prescriptions I've done clinically, really written for more of a general public being able to do it in their everyday life.
You've consulted community organizations and schools, design firms. Can you highlight a special project where the ecotherapy principles influenced systemic or environmental changes?
Yeah, I consulted with a design firm that was working on the development of the Google campus down in Mountain View, California. And they were looking at how to utilize nature to spark creativity in the Googlers, the people that worked there. And they had a very large campus right on the bay. And they were looking at how to incorporate natural elements into the design. So a colleague and I went down, did a pre-site visit, walked the grounds, and they wanted us to help them identify potential human nature interaction that could happen, that could help spark creativity. And it was a fascinating project. And it culminated with an all-day, 8-hour workshop that we did with probably 30 people or so that were all part of the design team, the architects, the indoor designers, the landscape designers, all these kinds of things. And we first we had them walk the land with us, and none of them had been out on the land. And it was so interesting to see their enthusiasm when we came back indoors of what they saw and what the potential was, and then match them up so they could start to talk about how do we bring these colors and textures and experiences indoors? How can we encourage people can we set like binoculars on windowsills around the different elements of the building so they could look outside and see the birds that are out there and see the wildlife that was there? It was a multi-story building, and they were building 4 of them. And there were going to be walkways that were going to connect the buildings. And they were some of them were outdoor walkways, the top floors. Could they put planters along there of herbs like lavender or rosemary that people could touch and smell? And we know that there's a lot of positive qualities in interacting and simple things like that. Some of the people work strange hours. Could they pitch a tent outside up on the upper floor? Could they have a fire ring upstairs on the upper floor for their Friday night gatherings? There were a lot of those kinds of things that they discussed again, the idea was to spark creativity in the people that worked there. So they were drawing on some of the early research that showed that increase in creativity that could happen with nature surrounding them. So that was a really exciting one, and probably obviously a less well-known one, but to me as exciting. Many years ago, I volunteered when I still lived back in Pennsylvania, I volunteered to help with a memory care facility. They had the building there, and there was some unfinished land, and they were looking at building a place where the residents could walk a path with their walkers if need be, or in a wheelchair if need be, just to get outdoors a little bit. And I suggested, what about putting some raised beds in? We were just starting to understand and incorporate healing gardens in hospitals and that kind of thing. Could we put some simple raised beds where people could reach those to plant some things in? Because many older residents who would be in memory care very likely would have had gardens in their backyard in those communities in Western Pennsylvania. And they did. They put these raised beds in, and I got to help do that and help plant. And I remember the second summer I had gone back for something else I was doing there, and to see the look on a family member's face at their parent, their mother, who was holding a tomato that had been grown in the garden, and she could remember and talk about the kinds of tomatoes she grew in her home garden. She could remember those things. And the kind of joy it brought the adult children to see her experiencing some joyful memories that way. That had a big impact on me, maybe because I had a garden as a kid.
Lovely. It's so inspiring to see how different facilities and companies are incorporating nature and all the amazing work that you're doing. How do people get in touch with you or listening to this podcast, want to buy your book, or where's the best place for them to start?
Yeah. Oh, thanks for that question. My website is northwestecotherapy.com, all one word, northwestecotherapy.com. And at the bottom of each page, there's a ribbon with a link to the various books that I've done. And it gives a little bit of information about my approach to doing therapy. If there's a counselors or therapists out there that are interested in learning about that, sometimes it can just help to see how has somebody else done this? How might some of this work in my practice? So they're certainly welcome to take a look at that. Prescribing Nature is available now on all of the traditional outlets like Amazon and Barnes and Noble and so forth for pre-order. And the book is actually going to be released next month, October 21st. So I'm pretty excited about that.
And what do you, I guess the best way to frame this is, do you do a daily outdoor practice for your mental health? And if so, what is the practice?
I do. I'm outdoors a lot. I live in Western Oregon. I'm in the foothills of the Cascades, and I have a property that is right on the Mackenzie River, which is a beautiful whitewater river. People come here to fish for salmon and steelhead and that kind of thing. And first, I have my morning coffee every morning outdoors. We have a covered patio, even if it means bundling up in a blanket in the wintertime. It's dry, so I sit there and just start my day most days with that. And I earned my Master Gardener certification 20 years ago. So I have a lot of gardens where I am. So after a full day of sometimes working with folks or maybe writing, I need to get outside and get my hands in the soil and water my plants and take care of things that way. And I would say the gardening has been really special for me. And I have 2 dogs who are always helping me. I feel very blessed to have this setting to be in.
Dr. Patricia Hasbach, thank you for sharing your story on Stories from the Field.
Thank you so much for having me, Will, and thank you for your work.